Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Doris and I'm in the Department of Economics at Maynooth University. In this talk, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about why governments should care about inequality at all, what inequality means, what the government can do about inequality, how it's measured, and then I'm going to do an interview with Dr. Keane. So why should governments care about inequality? People care about fairness as well as how well off they are. Now, it's true that people care more in some countries, for example Sweden, than in other countries. For example, in the US, they seem to be willing to tolerate quite a high level of inequality. But I think it's fair to say that Irish people generally care quite a lot about inequality. We see that in many ways in terms of politicians that we vote for and responses to surveys. And governments should reflect their citizens' preferences about inequality. If Irish people care a lot about inequality, it's only right that governments should reflect that in their policies. And if citizens care about inequality, which they do, then it's not sustainable to allow inequality to grow. Citizens may end up rejecting the economic system that allows that inequality if it continues. So what does inequality mean? That's the first thing I'm going to look at. So let's start off with earnings inequality. So some people get paid more than other people. We call these wage differentials, which is also a topic on the Leaving Cert curriculum. So the main reason people get paid more than other people is that they have more human capital, more education or more labour market experience. Both of those things are part of your human capital. Or it could be because they're especially hard workers. They work long hours, they never miss a day, or it could be because they work for companies who happen to really value their qualifications. They have a great match with the company that they're working for. Or they work for companies who make very high profits and share some of those profits with their workers. Or they might get high earnings because they're not discriminated against. As we know, discrimination is a feature of the labour market. Gender discrimination, racial discrimination, these things exist and they matter. And finally, they can get paid more just because they're lucky. Okay, so you can be lucky by working for the right company, you can be lucky by falling into a job that really suits you. Luck is definitely an element of where you end up in the earnings distribution. So in this talk, I'm going to use some pictures to illustrate my points. So you have to imagine that the sizes of these people indicate their earnings or income. Big people earn a lot and small people earn less. And then we also have, you'll see, some transparent people, and they don't earn anything in the labour market. Maybe they're unemployed, or they're staying at home to mind children, or they're retired, or whatever. Okay, so these are the people we're going to work with. So I'm going to line the people up in order of their earnings. We're going to leave the people with no earnings out of it for now. So we're just looking at the people who actually earn money in the labour market. And the gap between the lowest earner, that tiny little purple person, and the highest earner, the big huge red person, is what we have in mind when we talk about earnings inequality. We're talking about the gap between the lowest paid, or the lowest earner, or the lowest income person, and the top person. If we add the non-earners back in, we have inequality of market income. So market income includes the non-earners. So in this picture, I've put them back down at the bottom. You have to imagine that the transparent people have zero earnings, so even less than the small purple person in our picture. So how does the government, or how can the government affect the income distribution? Well, there's a few ways it can do that. First of all, it pays benefits to people with low or no income, and to people with higher needs. So for example, it pays unemployment benefits, it pays pensions, state pensions to retired people, and then it also pays children's allowance to all people who have children, because people who have children have more demands on their income. So now we're going to fill in the transparent people. So they may have no labour market earnings, but they do have income because the government pays it to them. Okay, so watch the transparent people becomes filled in. Okay, so now they have income. Okay, so the next step is that the next way the government can affect the income distribution is to take income tax and PRSI from people's earnings. Now, Ireland has a very progressive tax system. We take much more from high earners than low earners. So this is what we're going to see in the next picture. Okay, so watch the people with high income, the big red person and the big black person in particular, their incomes get smaller. They've shrunk. The biggest people have shrunk the most. Although the big red person is still bigger than the big black person, the difference between them is smaller than it used to be, because people on the very highest earnings pay more tax than people on the lowest earnings. And the third way that the government can affect the income distribution is by the regulations it sets for wages, and in particular it sets the minimum wage. The minimum wage is currently set at £10.50 an hour, and interestingly, the government is seriously considering introducing what's called a living wage, and a living wage may be set at something up to £12.90 an hour. So a big increase for minimum wage workers if that's introduced. Okay, so this is what we've done so far. We've talked about why we should care about inequality. We've talked about what inequality means. We've talked about what the government can do about inequality. We thought that it can redistribute income through fiscal policy, taxes and benefit spending, and it does that in a progressive way. And it can also set minimum wages, although that's not necessarily as important. So the next thing we need to talk about is how it's measured. So if you have low or no income, but you're married to someone with high income, you're not poor, your disposable income is actually high. So we have to take that into account. And now you see why I put these little figures in colours. Each colour represents a different family. So people of the same colour live in the same household and share their income. So if you look at those black figures that I've circled there, you can see that because they share their incomes, we want to give them both the same income, which is the average of the two incomes. So watch and see what happens. Okay, now they both have the same income because they share. And we're going to do the same for the red household. Watch. So we can do that with all the households, all of them with their equalised income. So this was the original market income distribution that I showed you earlier. So you see there's a big gap between the zero earners and the big red earner. And this is the final disposable income distribution. So the inequality measure that I'm going to look at is the Gini coefficient. Now there are actually many ways of measuring inequality, but the Gini coefficient is very widely used, and you may have heard of it before. So what this does is it compares the actual income distribution with the perfect equality income distribution. So it's really helpful to draw a Lorenz curve. A Lorenz curve plots the share of all income received against the cumulative share of the population. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use real figures from the 2019 disposable income distribution in Ireland. So these are figures for Ireland that we're going to use. Okay, so we look at the bottom 10% and see what proportion of total income they earn. And what we see is that the bottom 10% get 4% of all income, so much less than their share in the population. And then we go to the bottom 20% and they get 9% of total income, again much less than their share. The bottom 30% get 16% and so on. We can do this all the way up. For example, the bottom 50% get 31%, and the bottom 90% get 77%. Now, if you look at that figure, notice that that means that the top 10% are getting the rest, which is 23%. So they get the top 10% gets a completely disproportionate amount of total income. Okay, so now we're going to plot these numbers, the share of the population against the share of income. So this is what you see. So 0% of the population gets 0% of income, so that's 1 point on the Lorenz curve. And at the other extreme, 100% of the population has to get 100% of income. So those 2 points are on every Lorenz curve. But the points in between depend on the distribution of income in the country. And what I've plotted here are the numbers for Ireland. So you see the bottom 10% gets 4% of income, and so on. Now we can compare this Lorenz curve, which is the actual Lorenz curve for Ireland, with the perfect equality Lorenz curve. And the perfect equality Lorenz curve is the curve where everyone gets the same income. So the bottom 10% get 10% of total income, the bottom 20% get 20% of total income, and so on. So this is what this looks like. It's just on the diagonal, okay? So you see it goes through 20%, 20%, 30%, 30%, and so on. Now, if there was perfect inequality, what that would mean would be that one person got all the income, and the Lorenz curve would be right-angled, like I've just filled in there. Okay, so they're the two extremes. Now, what are we going to do with this? Well, we can label the area between the actual Lorenz curve and the perfect equality Lorenz curve A. And we can label the area between the actual Lorenz curve and the perfect inequality right-angled one B. Okay, and we're going to use those areas to calculate the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is area A divided by area A plus B. Now, if there's no inequality, so everyone has the same income, the Lorenz curve is the diagonal perfect equality line. So area A disappears. So if you look at the calculation, the formula, area A is 0. So that means that the Gini coefficient is 0. So with perfect equality, the Gini equals 0. And if there's perfect inequality, so one person has all the income, then the Lorenz curve is right angled, and it's area B that disappears this time, right? So then you have area A divided by area A. So with that perfect inequality, the Gini equals 1. Okay, so they're the two extremes. The lowest the Gini can be is 0, and the highest it can be is 1. Real world Gini coefficients, of course, lie between the two. Okay, they lie between 0 and 1. So let me show you the Gini for Ireland for 2019. So for disposable income, that's the graph I just showed you, that gives a Gini coefficient of 0.28, right? Whereas the Gini coefficient for market income, that's before taxes and transfers, the Gini for market income is 0.52, so much higher. Okay, so we've looked at why we should care about inequality, what it means, what the government can do about inequality, and now we've looked at how inequality is measured. So now I'm going to show you an interview with a former Maynooth student, Dr. Keane of the Economic and Social Research Institute. And she's going to tell us how inequality compares to other countries and how inequality has been changing over time, both in Ireland and in those other countries. This is her area of research, and she's really an expert on this.
Hi Claire, how are you doing? Good to see you. It's very nice to have you back talking to us again.
Thanks for having me.
So how unequal is Ireland compared to other countries?
If we compare ourselves to, say, other developed countries, we know in developing countries there tends to often be more inequality in income, but compared to, say, other European countries or OECD countries, and that would cover countries like, mainly European, but also America, Australia, New Zealand, we're pretty much average. So we're relatively similar to sort of OECD average in terms of income inequality. So we're not very low, like the Nordic countries like Iceland, Sweden, and Denmark. But we would be lower than countries, say, like the UK or the US, for example. Mm-hmm. And that's if we look at income inequality based on the sort of money that we have in our pocket, our disposable income. So any income we have after we work, after we get maybe any social welfare, and after we pay our taxes and our social insurance. The one place that we do stand out is in terms of the inequality measured by market income inequality. And that basically means if we forget about the tax system and the social welfare system and we just look at people's earnings, so what employees or self-employed people would earn, we have quite high inequality in that income before the tax and welfare system comes along and redistributes between people.
Okay. So when you talk about social welfare income, is it all unemployment benefits, or would it also be pensions, that kind of thing?
It's right across the board. So unemployment benefits would be an important one. Pensions, disability payments, carers payments, all of those payments. And one of the reasons why it's been suggested that we have sort of relatively high income inequality in terms of people's earnings is that we have quite a large proportion of people compared to other countries who are households where there's nobody at work, or people are working very, very low hours. And that's been one of the reasons put forward as to why Ireland, despite having sort of being average in terms of income inequality after taxes and social welfare, because we have a substantial number of households where people aren't working or aren't working full time, that's sort of one of the drivers as to why we have quite high market income inequality, but we're sort of average once the tax and social welfare system kicks in.
How has that been going over time, our inequality over time? How has that looked?
So if we go back to really the best information we have is sort of from the late 1980s onwards, that's when we have data to actually be able to measure income inequality. We've had sort of stabilization or a bit of a fall in income inequality over time. So not very much has actually changed. If we look just before the pandemic, a couple of common measures of inequality were at the lowest level seen since the late 1980s, but there hasn't been, very sharp drops. It's tended to be fairly constant. We can see that sort of fluctuates over time. So there was time periods in those 30 to 40 years where, for example, the Great Recession, as we call it, great meaning very large and not great for the country. In the late 2000s, we saw then that there was quite a lot of job losses, particularly youth unemployment was quite high. And there was a rise in inequality then, a sort of divide by, I suppose, people working and not working. But we've seen that just before the pandemic, really this had, we sort of bounced back and inequality had fallen again.
And how does that compare with other countries? Did other countries also have stable inequality over time?
This, I suppose, is the big, the big news story here, is that really that's not the case. We're very much an outlier in developed countries across, as I said, Europe or the OECD. What we've seen and what's been well documented is that in the last few decades has been constantly rising inequality in other countries. So Ireland really stands out there by standing still and by not changing very much or having actually a bit of a fall in inequality. We're very, very different to our European and our OECD neighbours. And as I said, it's largely in part because each income group, lower, middle and higher incomes, the growth that we've seen in their incomes has consistently risen across the groups. In a lot of other countries, we often see that higher income or higher earners, their income has grown more sharply, and people at the middle or the bottom, say, in terms of income, that they haven't seen the same sort of rises. So we're very, very different in international circles.
Is that because of government policy, do you think? Is that where it's coming from?
I think a lot of this is down to government policy, and a lot of this is something we can be quite proud of, I think, as a country. So that, in other countries where inequality is rising, there's lots of questions as to how we could possibly, is that something we want to see? How could we reduce that? In Ireland, government policy has really tried to tackle and keep things consistent. And it's sort of interesting as well, because what we see in some other countries, say, depending on the political, who's ever in power at a particular time, things can swing quite a lot. In Ireland, actually, we have very consistent, even though we have different people in power at different times over 30, 40 years, it's been, the sort of attitude towards redistribution has been quite constant. So while, as I said there earlier, the inequality that we see measured by people's earnings, people who are working, that's quite high. Our tax and our welfare system is doing a lot to redistribute and make sure that people at the lower end of the income distribution are protected and that their incomes are protected.
People at the top end of the distribution pay a lot more tax than the people at the bottom end of the distribution. Is that what's going on?
So we have what would be known as one of the most progressive tax systems in the OECD. Progressive meaning exactly just what you said. People on higher incomes pay much more tax than people on lower incomes. In fact, what we see in Ireland is that there are a large proportion of lower earners who don't pay any tax at all or pay very low amounts. And then it increased quite sharply with income. If we look back, we can see that, in the 80s and 90s, Ireland was, by comparison, a relatively high inequality country. And by sort of staying still, all these other countries, because inequality has risen, we have sort of stayed still, but stayed still from a good point of view, because things haven't worsened in terms of inequality. And what that means is that while we used to be a high income inequality country, we're now pretty much average. Standing still, it's been actually a really good thing, because other countries, things have worsened.
That's really interesting. And people often talk about the minimum wage as a way of reducing inequality. And I notice you haven't really mentioned that. Do you think that helps at all or much?
So the minimum wage certainly has, a place in that it's probably done something to help the incomes of those who are, lower earners. But what we actually find is when we talk about inequality, we talk about it not from an individual person's point of view, but we look at the situation of their household. So we group together, say, couples with their children, and we look at the incomes they have, and it's that household income is how we measure, that's the income, right, and how we measure inequality. So ESRI research has actually shown that if you look at where people are, so if we look at minimum wage earners, we probably first of all start to think, oh, they're all down at the very bottom, they're all in lower income groups. And actually, that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows that minimum wage workers are spread right throughout income groups, because a lot of minimum wage workers, it's going to be mainly females, are often partnered with somebody who has higher income. So actually, tackling or changing and increasing the minimum wage doesn't do a huge amount to tackle inequality, because those people are spread right throughout income groups.
That's really interesting, especially because the government is thinking of introducing a living wage now, which would effectively be a higher minimum wage. That's an interesting point. Okay, that's been really useful. Thanks a million for that, Claire. I really appreciate all the insights, and talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so why has inequality been rising in so many countries, as Claire mentioned? So what's happened is that in most OECD countries, the wages of high-skilled workers have risen relative to the wages of low-skilled workers. And that has meant that the gap between high-skilled, high-wage workers and low-skilled, low-wage workers has grown even further. And that's an increase in market income inequality. And this increase in market income inequality has resulted in increased disposable income inequality. So economists have been looking at this, and over the years they've come up with two main explanations for this fact that inequality has been growing, not just in one or two countries, but in most countries. And the two suggested explanations have to do with globalization and skill-biased technological change. Trade between countries has risen dramatically in the last 50 years. Low-skilled workers' work has been outsourced to less developed countries to some extent, and the workers who are high-skilled in the developed countries have benefited from this. And sure enough, economic theory predicts that this will reduce wages for low-skilled workers. Now, the second explanation, and this is actually the one that most of the evidence supports, is the explanation to do with skill-biased technological change. So the idea here is that, since the 1980s, there's been increasing use of computers in the workplace, which has increased the productivity of high-skilled workers. High-skilled workers are good at learning how to use the new technologies, and so it's made them more effective workers. And more effective, more productive workers are paid higher wages. So high-skilled workers have really benefited from this computerization of the workplace. On the other hand, the impact on low-skilled workers has been more negative. Some of those jobs have been replaced by computers. That's reduced the demand for low-skilled workers, which has lowered their wages. And so both of those things have served to increase the gap between high-skilled and low-skilled workers. So as I said, the evidence is mostly in favour of the skill-biased technological change argument, but the research on this is continuing. It's a very interesting area of research. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that interesting. I hope you learned something about inequality that you didn't know before, and maybe even something that will help you in your exams, and good luck with those.